And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. Brexit and Trump, just speed bumps on the irreversible march of globalization. Former WTO General Director Pascal Lamy explains right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The 23-year-old multilateral trading institution, the WTO, or World Trade Organization, has faced several core challenges in recent years. Amid growing global trade tensions, the call for WTO reforms is high. The reform process has begun following an agreement reached at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires earlier this month. The European Union has put forward proposals which have been rebuffed by the Trump administration. Last week, the WTO Deputy Director General visited Washington to outline his opinions about the reform. Meanwhile, a great many WTO members expressed their concerns over unilateralism and protectionist policies of the U.S. during the 14th WTO Trade Policy Review of the country. China and the EU also accused Washington of paralyzing the WTO by blocking new appointments to its dispute settlement mechanism, or the Appellate Body. Earlier, on the sidelines of Understanding China International Conference, I sat down with Pascal Lamy, former Director General of WTO, to get his insights about the future of the WTO reform and the role U.S. plays in the trade dispute. There are players, important players in the world, maybe I shouldn't use plural form, that just do not believe multilateral system works at all. And it's being clearly said in many of the politically, rhetorically sounding speeches. So if you have a message as clear as that, any reform done by WTO is just still going to be viable to legislate to those players.
I'm not sure I would agree with you on that. I think the reality is that we do not know whether Mr. Trump is after improving the system, which he believes should work better for his country, or whether he's about wrecking the system, getting rid of the system because he believes that bilateralism is better than multilateralism.
People would caution because what you said is about strategic thinking of a country or of an economy. But maybe what is going on, some say, is really about 2020 rather than anything else, the presidential election itself. So is the rest of the world trying to do everything in order to please a thought which is totally focusing on a domestic election? That is the question.
If financial markets or the stock market dislike trade wars, this will impact the U.S. president position for his re-election. As you know, in the U.S., stock markets have a big bearing on public mood and on politics. So what we've seen so far is that Mr. Trump has been extremely aggressive, but each time the stock markets have sent a signal of dislike, then whoop, the thing has cooled down. Financial markets sometimes are the ones who tell what should be done or not done. You may like it or not like it. In the U.S., I think that's the way it works.
Earlier, from the EU side, there was suggestion that NAFTA 2, which is also called USMCA, are not necessarily following the basic rules and the principles of the WTO. Of course, that does not mean that the EU would file a complaint about that or have a big issue, a fight about it. But that is an interesting precedence we are seeing these days. It's also one of the biggest victories claimed by the Trump administration so far when it comes to trade negotiations. So, Mr. Lamy, with that in mind, what's next?
I will make a big fuss about the renegotiation of NAFTA.
You're not making a big fuss because it's difficult to make a big fuss?
Giving a new name to an agreement the software of which you've changed a bit does not need, it's not a revolution. And countries have always negotiated bilateral deals on top of multilateral deals. So I don't think it's a big problem. And by the way, the EU itself is also negotiating bilateral trade agreements. They just signed the big, huge, the biggest ever signed trade agreement by the EU with Japan. So I think this is not a problem.
But what exactly is that barometer that you're looking at, Mr. Lamy? Whether the U.S. is willing to be still part of WTO while improving the system, or it is not anymore, and it has already decided as they claimed already?
I think this is a very big question. I don't have the answer, and I do not know whether the U.S. are hiding their real position or whether they still don't know. And there are two possible options. Now, in this case, you have to think, but you also have to prepare. So there has to be a plan A, which is, let's work with the U.S. to improve the system. China needs to do that, Europe needs to do that, US needs to do that, okay. Then there is a plan B. If plan A doesn't work, or if the US take it my way or no way, which is a sort of blackmail, then there has to be a plan B where, other than the US, create an international trade organization, which will be the World Trade Organization minus the US. I don't think this should happen. I don't think this would be good for anybody, neither, by the way, for the US. But, you know, in this sort of case, you have to prepare. In case your judgment on whether the US want to do this or that is right or wrong, prepare for plan A and prepare for plan B.
The WTO debate is going on. We also see China and the United States are in their direct trade negotiations. There is timelines that both leadership from the two countries have set for themselves, something about beginning of next year and then the very beginning of March next year. So how do you see these biggest economies trade discussion negotiations among themselves likely to have direct or indirect impacts on what's going on in Geneva within the WTO debate halls?
I think that in the problems US and China have to solve, there are two categories. One which may be solved between US and China. Then there is another category which has to do with the real problem and the real medicine, which is whether, for instance, China is in the letter or the spirit of WTO rules when it subsidizes its state-owned enterprises. Now, this is not a bilateral issue. This is an issue for Geneva, for the WTO. So I think there is a continuum between what US and China can agree within the 90 days and what will have to happen, following, by the way, the G20 decision, which was okay both for China and for the US. That WTO reform has to take place. And again, this is an issue for the negotiating table in Geneva, not somewhere between Washington and Beijing.
All these things have to go on at the same time. The reform of the WTO, the reform of one's own structure and the economy, for example, China, that of the United States, and probably other economies as well, and also the bilateral and multilateral trade discussion.
It's a big kitchen,
it's
and
a big
there are
kitchen.
many dishes cooking.
A lot of cooks are cooking.
Agree.
All in very different styles.
Agree, but that's, you know, that's a necessity in these big, complex global world we live in.
Well, you are describing it. It's already making me very fascinated about it. Mr. Lamy, are we seeing almost a revisit of a blank sheet of systems since the Second World War? In other words, we really have to redraw the picture, or we are really refining the original picture. There's a huge difference between these two.
Yeah, I mean, intellectually, I do not think with 190 sovereigns on this planet, starting with a new blank sheet will lead anywhere before 20 years. So, pragmatically,
to say the least.
Pragmatically, I take the situation as it is. There is a need for improvement. It's true that the rules of the multilateral governance system were fixed 70 years ago with a Western software which may not fit with big new players like China, India, Indonesia, or Brazil. So there is a necessity to rearrange the system, not just, in my view, between sovereigns, no, cities, corporates, NGOs, trade unions now are international actors, which they were not 70 years ago. So it's a much more diverse, but you're absolutely right. We need a new approach. We need new ingredients in order for countries who did not seriously exist internationally at the time to have their place around the table, their stake, their responsibilities, and their views.
China has been party to the trade bloc for more than 17 years. I mean, China is a member of the WTO. Mr. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of WTO, said China's entry into the WTO and its reform and opening up process have transformed China. The question now is whether the existing global economic system can cooperate with some Chinese characteristics. China's entry into the WTO, how much it is intertwined with China's reform and opening up?
First, I think China joining the WTO in 2001 was a direct consequence of Deng Xiaoping opening and reform move. It was a concrete sign that China wanted to join the international economy and the global capitalist market system, which was a big step forward. It was not China saying the rest of the system must look like us. It was we must look like the rest of the system. And that's a big change. Now, in the meantime, China has enormously grown. I mean, when it joined WTO in 2001, it still was a small country economically. We are in a totally different world. And the question now, on the economic side, the question is, can global market capitalism survive, prosper, develop with a China which has its own characteristics? Do we have a sort of global market system with US or European characteristics, and another system which is the same system but with Chinese characteristics? How much should Chinese characteristics adjust to that? How much should the global system adjust to some Chinese characteristics? I think that's the big question.
That's a big question and fascinating question.
That's the one we have to deal with for years to come. And this is where the thing reloops into the US problem. I mean, the US problem with the world today does not have to do with trade. They have to do with the fact that the US social system is too weak to address a number of negative consequences of the positive side of globalization.
For the world who used to mistake or assumed that China's joining into the WTO would mean China totally subscribed to everything of the West. Now, what does it take for them to also walk with China, not work, but walk with China, to have the right proportion, as you have just wonderfully illustrated?
Well, I agree with you that that's the big problem. You know, how much of economic sameness and how much of political differences? I don't think in the 20 or 30 years to come, the Chinese people will look like the American people or the European people or even the African people. There are differences. They must be respected. The question again is whether there is enough consensus that we have to address issues of financial stability, of migration control, or environment degradation together.
The real common ground.
Absolutely. And this will bring huge benefits to us all while keeping some political differences which stem from deeply rooted cultural, religious, spiritual, philosophical differences. After all, globalization is not uniformization. It's doing together the challenges we have to face together.
Will the reform of the WTO be part of that process or testing process of whether to be able to walk together? That brings us back, Mr. Lamy, to the question of reform. What do you say are some of the top priorities that at least countries can work together on?
I think if the question is what is the agenda of WTO reform, I think there are three categories. One urgent, one to be taken then, and one which will need to be addressed, but less urgently. The urgent ones are review of the WTO agreement on subsidies, which for the moment is too weak, too shallow. The WTO disciplines on subsidization need to be strengthened, not just about China, also about other countries, so that we re-level the playing field in this area. And second is reviewing a few processes of the Appellate Body in order to address US problems so that they de-lock what they've locked in nominating judges. Otherwise, judges will have to be nominated according to another procedure. Then you have a number of issues which stem from the previous Doha agenda, which still remain to be addressed. For instance, agricultural subsidies. It's understandable that if I'm an African producer of cotton, I don't like having to fight with the US Treasury. These issues also have to do with fairness, and they've been pending for quite a bit of time. And then you have a third box, probably for later, but which is adjusting the rule book to new realities, such as digitalization, for instance. Whether they can be freely traded, whether they have to be localized, whether they have to be controlled. This now needs a sort of global regulation, whereas it wasn't necessary 20 or 30 years ago.
The question is, what about the next step? Is there a time frame?
The first two issues, subsidies
for
and the Appellate Body, this is something that, in my view, needs to be done in the next 18 months.
If we fail that?
That would be a pity, because then the threat on opening trade and keeping trade open will be bigger, and I don't think it's a good thing.
Some believe economies can be decoupled from the rest of the world. Countries can be decoupled from the rest of the world. Is it possible?
I don't think so. I think we've reached a stage of globalization, a level of globalization that makes deglobalization extremely unlikely, because it makes it extremely costly. And we have a good example of that with Brexit in Europe. It's a sort of lab of a mini deglobalization. Getting the UK egg out of the EU omelette proves to be extremely costly and extremely difficult. Now, to go back to the big picture, I think Mr. Trump is after decoupling, to some extent, US and China. And this is probably what will happen. A bit of decoupling, but this will not be deglobalization. This will be compensated by more coupling of US and the rest of Asia, or more coupling of China and EU. Take one example, which is textile global production chains. Yes. A bit of that, the end part of the value chain, the assembly part for apparel or for sport shoes, goes outside China to Vietnam or Ethiopia or Egypt. This will reduce a bit the trade deficit between US and China. This will increase the trade deficit between US and Vietnam or Egypt or Ethiopia. Globally, this will not change.